2006 in the Olin Seminar Series. I don't know if there's anyone here who doesn't know who I am. I'm Debbie Tratra. I'm a professor here at Olin College. It's a pleasure and an honor to have Cory Doctorow today as our guest. For those of you who are not familiar with him, there's sort of three major areas in which he's known for his contributions. First of those is that he's a blogger. He's one of the co-editors of Boing Boing, which is a pretty well-respected blog that looks at the intersection of technology and culture and politics. The second thing he's really known for doing is being an activist. He worked for the Electronic Frontier Foundation for 4 years as the Director of European Affairs. So he's basically involved in advocating for citizens' rights in the digital realm. And the reason why I just used the past tense to talk about his position at the EFF is because as of January 1st, he's quit his day job and became a full-time writer. So he's now involved in both journalism, but I think it's fair to say that your primary focus is writing fiction, so writing novels and short stories. Cory's received a number of awards for these, including the John W. Campbell Award at the 2000 Hugos for Best New Writer, as well as the inclusion of one of his stories in the 2005 Best American Short Stories collection. So I realized when I was putting this together that to actually fully detail all of the things that he's sort of done and has accomplished would A, take up the entire time of this talk, and B, would be redundant because he has a personal site, which is www.craphound.com, and I'm going to basically point you there to look at all those things. So today for his talk, he's going to be speaking, the title of his talk is Owned, How Hollywood, let's see if I can make sure I get this right, How Hollywood Plans on Making the Future Subservient to the Past. And I suspect that this will tie together his experiences as a blogger and as an activist and as an author. So I'd like to ask you to join me in warmly welcoming Cory Doctorow.
Thank you very much. So, entertainment companies have always fought the future. That part's not new. A little capsule history of how entertainment companies have fought the future starts at the turn of the last century with the advent of the phonograph. It was the first technology that was capable of reproducing music as a performance and not just as instructions for producing a performance. You know, this was the sheet music that predated that. So the first era of music reproduction technologies, performance reproduction technologies, were piano rolls. And the way that the piano roll worked was this. You walked into a store in Tin Pan Alley and you bought some sheet music. You took it to a shop and you ripped it to a digital format on a long roll of computer tape, right? Zeros and ones on a long roll of computer tape that you would play back in a special purpose computer called a player piano. And then you'd make thousands of these things and you'd sell them. And you wouldn't pay anyone for the right to go on selling them, that you'd have already acquired that right by buying the sheet music. And at the time, the composers who wrote the sheet music felt that this was a form of theft and that it should be stopped. They didn't just think that they should be compensated, but they thought that the new technology shouldn't be allowed to exist until they figured out what the best way was to get compensated for it. And if they decided that there wasn't enough compensation on offer for it, that it should just go away altogether. The proposal was that new technologies for reproducing sound should meet with the approval of the companies who make or the individuals and publishers who made sheet music. The sheet music authors didn't really feel like performers did anything particularly important. After all, they wrote down the instructions. All the performers did was follow them, right? So in their view, performance wasn't a particularly important or overly skilled trade, and they had the stats to prove it. People bought thousands and thousands and thousands of copies of sheet music that had been written by one composer, but performers, because they had no technology for reproducing a performance, were limited to audiences that were just the size that could pack into a hall like this one. And as a consequence, performers didn't have big names. They were kind of irrelevant to the industry. The important side of it was the composition side. And John Philip Sousa, the great American composer, went to Congress in 1908 as part of this campaign to shut down music reproduction technologies. And he said, if these infernal talking machines are allowed to continue, we won't have a voice box left in America. We will lose our voice boxes as we lost our tails when we came down out of the trees. Now, many points to Sousa for being an early advocate of the still controversial theory of natural selection, if a bit of a Lysenkoist, but many points off for having mistaken his corner of the industry for all possible entertainment industries. Now, the story of fighting the future is the story of pirates who become admirals and defend themselves against the next generation of pirates. And that next generation of pirates cropped up a decade or two later with the people who wanted to take those recordings and put them on the air, the Marconi people, the radio people. And the people who were now making their livings from phonograms, and the way that they were doing this is that instead of Congress mandating that these technologies should be unlawful, Congress instead mandated that the incumbents who controlled all the copyrighted works to date, the people who made the sheet music, should be required by law to license it to people who wanted to reproduce it in mechanical reproductions at a set fee, 2 cents per disc. So the way that it would work then is you'd buy some sheet music, you'd rip it to a digital format or a disc, and you'd resell that, and every time you resold one, you'd pay the person who gave it to you 2 cents. No one had to pay a $400 an hour lawyer to negotiate with another $400 an hour lawyer to find out whether or not that would be a 10-cent or a 2-cent or a 3-cent royalty. You just did it, and no one could say no. So this is how, Sid Vicious is able to record My Way. He doesn't have to go and get Anka's permission to record My Way. He can just do it because there's a compulsory license that requires the people who compose these works to license it out. And of course, that was very good for the phonogram industry. It made it possible for like 1,000 times more artists to make 1,000 times more art that reached an audience 1,000 times larger and made 1,000 times more money. It was a great deal for everyone. But along comes radio. And radio was far more disruptive than Napster could ever hope to be, because what radio did was transform performance from something that had 100% control over its audience, right? In other words, we could have the performance business model, which is to have a hall like this and a bald guy with tattoos at the door, and if you don't buy a ticket, the bald guy with tattoos punches you and throws you out the door, right? It's 100% control over who gets to listen to a performance or attend a performance. With radio and phonograms, we move into a world with 0% control. If there's an 8-year-old in your household with the skill to build or acquire a crystal set, tune into these performances without permission. And of course, none of the people who made phonograms and controlled the supply of works that could be played on the radio was anxious to license it to the radio people. They felt that it just shouldn't be licensed at all. And so what they said was that they would withhold their works, and that the people who put their works on the air were pirates, right? What we did when we made phonograms from the sheet music, that was progress. What these people are doing, when they take the phonograms we made from the sheet music and put it on the radio, that's piracy, right? And of course, eventually, the pirates prevailed. They institutionalized the practice of radio, again, through a blanket license. No DJ picks up the phone and calls a $400 an hour lawyer who negotiates with another $400 an hour lawyer to find out before he drops the needle whether this track is going to cost 10 cents or 15 cents to put on the air. Instead, you pay a blanket fee to a collecting society. That money is apportioned to artists based on a statistical sampling of what gets played on the radio, and more artists make more money by making more art that reaches more people. And that's a good deal for everyone concerned. So then the pirates of radio, the pirates of radio broadcast, of radio diffusion of broadcasts, a decade or two later, find themselves confronted with the specter of a new generation of pirates, the cable TV pirates, who of course can't get licenses to pick up broadcast shows and put them down over the wire, because if you've invested a lot of money in broadcast infrastructure, you'd be crazy to license this stuff to people who are delivering signal over the wire, which is much cleaner, less attenuated, not subject to multipath interference, and in many respects superior to a broadcast experience. And so they just withheld the licenses. So the cable people did what the phonogram and the radio people had done. They stuck up an antenna at the head end of the cable. They pulled in all those broadcast signals. They pushed them down over the wire, didn't pay anyone a cent. And of course, the people, the radio pirates who had ripped off the phonogram pirates, who'd ripped off the sheet music people, they said, these new pirates are doing something illegitimate. What we did was progress. What they're doing is piracy. And Congress continued in a long string of important decisions grounded in the intuition that if you break your constituents' televisions, they won't vote for you anymore. What they said is, we will require people who make broadcast television to license their works to cable operators. And again, that's in place today. Now, not long thereafter, the cable operators turned around and confronted a new generation of pirates. These were the pirates who made VCRs, right? VCRs allowed you to make verbatim copies of creative works that you could then copy, and you could share, and you could library, and you could access later, and you could time shift. You could break their business model, which was grounded in real-time playback with no user control, where they could control who was going to be watching it and sell advertising against different blocks of time, and not just programming, but different blocks of time. They'd say, well, we know that there's a certain kind of person who's at home between 10 and 3 in the afternoon. So regardless of what programming we put on, we know that we can sell to that demographic to our advertisers and so on. Once you introduce time shifting, that goes out the window. All the traditional grounding in this. Now, the people who made cable and broadcast and so on, they got together to fight the pirates of the VCR. And Congress didn't actually pass any new copyright laws after that. They actually did something, I think, even smarter, which is they refused to do anything about it. They said, let the courts handle this, because, of course, no one elects judges. No one elects Supreme Court judges. So if they break America's televisions, it won't be our problem. And so they just punted. They held hearings. 1982, Jack Valenti, who was the mouthpiece for the Motion Picture Association of America, Jack Valenti turned up at UCLA at congressional hearings to say these VCRs, these infernal machines, these machines that are the product of the same Japanese companies that have destroyed our auto industry and are now gunning for the last great American industry, the last uniquely American industry, which is entertainment. These machines are to the American film industry as the Boston Strangler is to a woman home alone. And obviously, he'd been taking his cues from our friend Mr. Sousa. He doesn't even get the benefit of having advanced natural selection as a brief revolution. He was just wrong. He was really wrong. If you look around today, pre-recorded media accounts for the lion's share of the film industry's revenue, and they have yet to repudiate any of these statements. In fact, what often happens when I give a talk like this in a policy forum with someone from the MPAA present to rebut, in Brussels or in Washington or whatever, afterwards the MPAA person will come up to me and say, why do you guys always talk about that Boston Strangler quote? For Christ's sake, that was 20 years ago. And I say, well, have you repudiated it? Like, did you lie to Congress? Are you gonna tell Congress you were wrong? Would you like to issue a statement? In fact, they haven't ever issued a statement saying that the VCR was good for business. Jack Valenti, in his exit interview when he left the MPAA a couple of years ago, held his statement up. He said that he was right then, and he stands by it today. And of course, the MPAA has just unveiled its new building in DC, the Jack Valenti building. So if you're under any illusions about whether or not that attitude still prevails, I think it does. So the entertainment companies always fought the future. The courts and Congress have always preserved the future by saying copyright, the system of industrial regulation that regulates technologies for copying and diffusing works, copyright should change to reflect new realities in technology. Technology shouldn't be retarded so that, to ensure that it doesn't ever venture into waters that were never mapped by copyright the last time we sat down and drafted a copyright law. Because, of course, if you sit down as Congress to draft a copyright law that expresses which elements of the author's right will be exclusive to the author and which elements will be given to the public, and you try to envision all conceivable uses that might be made in respect of new technologies that might emerge from now to the heat death of the universe, you'll never stop drafting, right? You'll be drafting law forever. So eventually you have to cut bait. You say, this is the law for now, and then a new technology comes along and lets you do phonorecording or radio diffusion or cable diffusion or time shifting or librarying or the internet, and then you have to draft a new copyright law. But this time around, something different is happening. This time around, the entertainment industry and the technology industry have decided to collaborate to take away the liberties that technology could give us, and in the process are breaking some of the democratic fundamentals that we all depend on, like free speech, due process, privacy, and so on. Your family arrangements, your private viewing choices, your freedom to make and use open source software, they're all in danger as a consequence of the new regime that prevails when we consider how to revise copyright law to take account of technology. What is actually underway here is a rewriting of the copyright bargain. But it's not a rewriting of the copyright bargain to give you the freedoms that technology might enable. It's a rewriting of the copyright bargain to turn technologies into architectures of control, to take away the freedoms that we've traditionally enjoyed because technology wasn't self-enforcing. Law wasn't self-enforcing in technology. And so the law, the edges of the law could be explored by users, and the law could be revised in response to the uses that users made. No one had to go to the entertainment industry and get a license to make VCRs before they introduced VCRs into the field. Instead, what happened was VCRs were introduced into the field. People made uses that no one was clear on what the legality would or wouldn't be, And after they had been in the field for some time, after we'd run a field trial, after 8 years of congressional wranglings and court wranglings, the Supreme Court got to examine the record on VCRs and say, how bad are VCRs for the entertainment industry, right? Is this really a technology that we need to be suppressing? But if you'd had to go to the Supreme Court a priori and say, well, someday someone will open a Blockbuster store, and that will account for new revenue, the Supreme Court might have said, well, that's a little too speculative for us to decide that we're going to enable that. Or, for example, if the radio people, if Marconi had to go to the entertainment industry of the day, to the recording performers of the day, and say, it's all right. I know that you've made every dollar you've ever put in your pocket by standing in a hall like this and having the big guy at the door business model, but I've got a new one for you. We're going to invent a new form of statistical math that will allow us to sample who's listening to what and what's being played. We're going to get an antitrust exemption that will allow us to create blanket licenses for music. We're going to get actors with baritone voices to extol the virtues of different brands of soap. And we're going to combine these into an alchemy that will produce more money for you. It may have been that Marconi never would have been able to ship his crazy dot-com business model. But instead, what we got to do was run the business model and then have the courts decide whether or not it was lawful retrospectively in respect of the actual experience of the technology on the ground, and not on the basis of what someone thinks might or might not happen when the technology is introduced in the field. But now we're entering an era of self-enforcing law and self-enforcing technology, where the copyright bargain is whatever it is the person who makes the technology says it is. And those self-enforcing technologies are embodied in something called digital rights management technology, which are the technologies that restrict what you do with works that you acquire lawfully after you acquire them. If you've ever tried to stream an iTunes to more than 5 CPUs in a 24-hour period and found that the software said you can't, that's digital rights management technology. If you've ever tried to add a WMV to a video that you're making using the Microsoft video editing tool and been told that because this is a restricted WMV or WMA that you can't do that, that's digital rights management technology. If you've ever acquired a movie abroad and brought it back and put it in your DVD player and discovered that it wouldn't play back, that's digital rights management technology. If you've ever tried to make a critical use of a work that was delivered in a PDF and you've selected some text to copy and paste and been told that this is a restricted document that you can't copy and paste out of, that's digital rights management technology. What this effectively does is bootstrap the monopoly over who gets to copy your works to an unlimited monopoly over who gets to design a technology capable of copying your works. That when the film industry sits down and says, we are only going to license our works for use in connection with DVDs, if people who make DVDs agree that they will control the design of DVDs through patent licensing and ensure that DVD players don't introduce any features that might disrupt our business, what they're essentially saying is that our right to control copies my movie is in fact a right to control who can design technologies capable of copying my movie. This starts to intrude on areas that we've never had copyright intrude upon, and I'll touch on some of that further in the talk. For example, if you have a technology that says you can only use this on the devices owned by one family, then the technology de facto defines what a family is and of course, what a family isn't. Also things like how your network can be configured, because a lot of these technologies are now attempting to control whether or not you're streaming media from a storage unit to a playback unit, ensuring that that only happens locally. And again, locally gets to be defined by a rights holder group and not by law or practice. And the way that they determine locality is often things like round-trip times or ping times, time to live, and so on. Depending on how your network configuration looks, it may be that you generate false positives when they test to see whether or not your screen is local to your, or not local to your storage unit. So again, this is intruding on areas that we've never really had copyright involved with. No one ever said, in order to play this record, you've got to situate your record player thus and so in your sitting room. But we are having people say that in order to play this television, you've got to configure your router thus and so, or it won't play back. One area that is particularly invasive, one area that's particularly troublesome, is the impact of this on free and open source software technologies and free and open source hardware technologies. Open source technology, you folks are a technical audience. I take it you know what open source technology is. What you may not think about much is the way that it's situated historically. For 500 years, what passed for science was alchemy. It was a practice of exploring the natural world using much the same tools that we use today, observation and experimentation and so on. But the primary difference was that alchemists didn't tell anyone else what they discovered. And as a consequence, for 500 years, every alchemist discovered for himself that drinking mercury was poison, right? And we have a name for that period. We call it the Dark Ages, right? Now, at the end of that, an alchemist got the idea of publishing his outcomes so that his peers could review it, right? We have a name for that period, too. We call it the Enlightenment, right? Open source software is grounded in this tradition. It's the idea that not only should you be able to use technologies, you should be able to observe their workings, understand their workings, improve on their workings, and share your outcomes with other people. But every technology that treats the user as the attacker, right? Every technology that says you may not copy and paste out of this document, every technology that says you may not play back this disk, is a technology that believes that you're the one who needs to be defended against, and as a consequence has to be designed to resist your modification of the technology. That's never been a design consideration in most technologies. In fact, the entire patent system exists to get us away from an era in which it's the order of the day that people who invented new inventions obfuscated the workings of those inventions. The idea of a patent system is, in exchange for a 20-year monopoly, and monopolies should, in an open economy, should be presumptively evil, and anyone who wants a monopoly has to defend, should be forced to defend it, not the other way around. We shouldn't say, well, monopolies are presumptively good, and if you don't like monopolies, you have to prove that this one will generate a market failure. But in exchange for the evil of a monopoly, we get the public good of disclosure of the workings of the invention, right? Of extensive disclosure of the working of the invention, so that when the monopoly expires, practitioners like the people in this room can build on that, can stand on the shoulders of giants, can engage in a tradition as old as the Enlightenment. So these technologies are necessarily designed so that their owners and users can't modify or understand them. If you've ever tried to implement a DRM technology, you'll find that as a prerequisite to implementing it, you have to license something. It's usually either a key or a patent or the combination thereof. Again, there's a monopoly there, so there's something where they can force you to take a license. And a condition of that license is something called compliance and robustness, which means that the technology has to be designed to resist user modification. And we see this throughout the DRM standards universe. And of course, this is the opposite of open source, which is designed to be understood and modified by its users. Digital rights management technology, by contrast with open source technology, digital rights management technology is the opposite of the scientific tradition. It's based on wishful thinking and law. It's a kind of Lysenkoism. Lysenko was the Soviet scientist who had ideologically correct ideas about how the world would work that had no nexus with how the world observably did work. So he came up with ideologically correct ways of cultivating wheat, for example, that failed utterly to cultivate wheat. But because it was unlawful to report on the fact that field over there is not full of wheat, in fact it's full of naked emperors, no one ever got to advance past Lysenkoism for a long time, and this was a terrible hardship to people who labored under that regime. We have a kind of modern Lysenkoism in DRM, in that one of the areas of DRM that is the subject of law and policy is that DRM's workings are not allowed to be disclosed. Right? It's a kind of security system that gets more secure when you wrap up its workings in secrecy. Now, the practitioners of information security in particular know that the only way to secure something, the only experimental methodology for determining whether or not something you've designed is secure, is to tell people how it works and see if they can think of a way of breaking it, because any person is capable of coming up with a system so fiendishly clever that he himself can't think of a way of breaking it. Right? I can come up with a security system that I can't imagine a break for. That doesn't mean that no break for it exists. The wider the pool of experts you expose your security system to, the larger the probability that someone will uncover it. So we now have DRM systems that are built on the idea that no one should be allowed to understand their workings, and that's backed up. It starts with something with a treaty that was passed at the United Nations specialized agency that covers copyright, the World Intellectual Property Organization, or WIPO. in 1996, an American kind of apparatchik went to Geneva and got a treaty passed called the WIPO Copyright Treaty and a companion treaty called the WIPO Performer and Phonograms Treaties, the WPT and the WCT and the WPPT, that say that if you tell someone how a DRM system works, you break the law. If you tell someone where they can find out how a DRM system works, you break the law. If you tell someone who they should ask to find out how a DRM system works, you break the law. And we've encountered this as a genuine problem for people engaged in security research and information security and information design, information theory. One of the first victims of this was a guy named Ed Felton, who's a professor at Princeton, distinguished engineering professor. You can read his blog. It's very good, freedomtotinker.com. And I love Ed for many things, but mostly for framing this in terms that I think every engineer should have an intuitive sense of, that there is a fundamental freedom at stake here, that freedom to tinker, and that the engineers of today are the tinkerers of yesterday, the people who grew up tinkering. I'll digress just a little here to tell a story. I was at a DRM standards body meeting for a European version of the broadcast flag. This is an American initiative that says that people who build digital television receivers should have to build them in such a way so that users can modify them. And it was the month before Christmas, and we were in Edinburgh, and the Microsoft rep went out at the lunch break and bought a science kit for his 7-year-old son for Christmas, and he brought it back, and he was showing it around to the engineers at lunch. And the guy from the BBC said, "Oh, I remember that. My granddad took me out in the shed when I was a boy, and we built a crystal set out of cat's whiskers and crystals, and we tuned in radio stations. It was magic. That's how I became a radio engineer and came to be here representing the BBC." And the Microsoft guy said, "Yeah, I remember. I had almost the same experience in my granddad's shed," and so on. And I turned around and said, "Are you guys listening to yourselves? We're in this room to design a standard that says that no one will ever be able to implement a tuner for digital television. No one will ever be able to do the 21st century equivalent of cat's whiskers and crystals ever again." Right? The way that you were set on the path to becoming engineers was because you had the freedom to tinker. So Ed, who's a tinkerer by nature, encountered a watermarking system for restricting copying that was developed by the music industry called the SDMI, the Secure Digital Watermarking Initiative. And what they said is that this is so secure that we believe that no one will ever be able to break it. And if you do break it, we'll give you a big pot of money. But you can't tell anyone how you broke it. So it's a competition, but we don't want to be embarrassed or anything. So Ed and some of his grad students sat down and in an afternoon, they undid years worth of consortia work. And being academics, they weren't interested in a big pot of money. They valued another currency much more highly, which was the esteem of their peers, right? They wanted to go and publish. And to that end, they presented a paper on this. They submitted a paper on this to a technical conference. And the response of the recording industry was, "If you talk about this math, we'll sue you." And their threat to the conference was, "If you let this Princeton engineer come and talk about math, we'll sue you." That's no better than Lysenkoism. Now, Ed was lucky because he is the kind of unimpeachable defendant that impact litigators like Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I used to work, love. Because judges are reluctant to tell Princeton engineers that they're not allowed to talk about math. So we took Ed to court, and we said we'd like a summary judgment because we've had a legal threat and so on. And the recording industry turned tail and run because they don't want to see precedents set against them. But what the entertainment industry has been happy to do is take less attractive defendants who are certainly should be available of the same rights and go after them. An instance of this came not long thereafter. July 17th, 2001, a Russian programmer called Dmitry Skilyarov came to Las Vegas and spoke at a hacker conference, a security conference, about the way that Adobe had implemented the restrictions in its Adobe ebook reader. They had made many of the tyro mistakes, the common beginner's mistakes in crypto. They had used the fixed key, most of the operation, and the fixed key was the word secret, and so on. I mean, mostly it was just a Zor, it wasn't a very well implemented security system. Of course, if you're someone who researches security, documenting this, describing this, and so on, very important. He gave his presentation. He walked out of his presentation. The FBI arrested him and put him in jail. And he went home a couple of weeks later, or a couple of months later, after the court proceedings had kind of unfolded for a while, he managed to get away, and he went home back to Russia. And the Russian equivalent of the State Department, right? Remember, this is the birthplace of Lysenkoism. The Russian State Department gave a warning to its scientists saying, don't go to America and present your technical findings. Apparently, they've turned into the kind of country where talking about some kind of math can get you stuck in a federal prison. Right? This is the opposite of science. This is Lysenkoism, and its outcome is always bad. One way to think about a DRM technology in terms of its security implementations, in terms of the wishful thinking that these legal strictures against disclosing the failings are based on, is DRM is a system that says that we can design a safe that's so secure that we'll keep it in the bank robber's living room. Right? DRM says, you are the attacker, and we are going to give you unlimited access to the playback device, the scrambling algorithm, and the keys that are used to scramble it, as well as the ciphertext. But we're going to imagine that some combination of these things and law will stop you from ever actually rendering out a clear text at will, that will stop you from decrypting it. And this is nonsensical. Digital rights management is not a contract. So people talk a lot about how digital rights management is copyright protection. But copyright is a system that balances out the rights of users with the rights of creators. And in fact, that distinction is a blurry one because every creator is a user of rights. If you see far, it's because you stand on the shoulders of giants. I've got a story that's on a couple of award ballots this year called iRobot. Now, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, but not just Asimov, who wrote a short story collection called iRobot that's very famous. Asimov nicked that title from someone else. He nicked it from Indo Binder, who actually used that title as a mashup of I, Claudius, whose author probably got it from someone else in turn. So every user of works is also a creator of works. Every creator of works is also a user of works. And it balances out those rights. And it reserves some rights to the public and some rights to creators. The rights that are reserved to the public in America in particular are very fact-intensive and situation-specific. For example, in the course of academic research, it's permissible to take large blocks of copyrighted works and quote them in the course of criticism or parody or academic research or what have you. If you're a mere copyist, that might not be lawful. Now, the microchip has never been made, the algorithm has never been written that can distinguish a parodist from a copyist. In fact, it's often the case that Supreme Court justices have a hard time distinguishing parodists from copyists. We saw, for example, when Two Live Crew sampled Oh Pretty Woman, Johnny Cash's song, for a song that they argued was a parody of his song. We saw that lower courts disagreed on whether or not it was a parody, and it wasn't until it went to the Supremes that there was a long, heated discussion about it that emerged the outcome that said this was in fact parodical, and Two Live Crew were allowed to make this use. Well, in order for your algorithm to model copyright, to protect copyright, your algorithm has to not only be able to do the artificially intelligent decision-making process necessary, the Turing-complete decision-making process necessary to distinguish parodists from copyists, it also has to be able to accurately model the minds of the current sitting Supreme Court justices. Right? This is unlikely to occur in my lifetime or yours. I think even if the experiments are right and we live to 1,000 years, it's unlikely to occur. As a consequence, a lot of people say, well, you're right. This may take away some of the rights that the law grants you as a user of copyrighted works under copyright, but maybe you contract out of them. For example, maybe when you subscribe to Napster and only get music that you rent instead of buy, you waive your right to own it, right, in exchange for the consideration that is music that you get more cheaply. And so it's a bargain. And of course, that's a pretty common transaction in the real world. You have a bunch of exclusive rights to something like a house, and then you bargain away some of those exclusive rights by taking in a tenant, right? So maybe you've got some rights in the music you acquire, and you bargain away some of those rights in consideration. But it's rarely the case that we see anything that looks like a contract emerge as part of a DRM transaction. Certainly, when you buy a DVD, there's no step at which you affirmatively waive your right to watch that DVD when you go abroad, right? You don't, by taking the shrink wrap off a DVD, you don't waive your right to watch it abroad. And yet, because of DRM, there are restrictions built into DVDs that say that if you buy a DVD in North America, you won't be able to watch it in Europe and vice versa. I had an amazing eye-opening discussion about this with a representative from the Motion Picture Association of America at another standards body meeting, where we were talking about whether or not digital television standards should be such that, depending on which program you were watching, different outputs on your receiver would shut down or turn on. This was a proposal that was made to the FCC under the name Selectable Output Control. And I said, well, surely when we're watching clear-to-air television, that is to say stuff broadcasted terrestrially without any encryption that would require you to take a license to a key, we have a suite of user rights that are both statutory and in common law. And those rights, I don't understand why you think that by changing the channel, I would waive my right to say output it to a DVD recorder or output it to a certain kind of screen or what have you. And the impact of this would be as you channeled up and down on your cable box, parts of your home theater would go dark. And he said, well, maybe you'd form an agreement to do this. Maybe you'd have a contract through which you waived your right to watch a show through a certain output or to record a show or what have you. And I said, well, I could see that, you know, it should be possible to contract out of the right to watch a show in exchange for some consideration. Walk me through how that contract would be formed. And they said, oh, it's really straightforward. You're watching Channel 3, you pick up the remote, you turn it to Channel 4, you agree, right? You formed an agreement by turning it to Channel 4. Well, it's a funny kind of agreement. It's like the agreement that you make when you walk into a shop and you pass the till and the shopkeeper leans out and punches you in the mouth and you say, what are you doing? And he says, well, you agreed when you came into my shop. You say, well, when did I agree? Well, I actually, I'd written that agreement up and put it under the doormat of another shop. And you know, I put it under the doormat of another shop, and by walking into this, you agree to that one. But even if you're willing to acknowledge that this is some kind of binding contract, that when you download an iTunes, you waive the right to play it on more than 5 CPUs, right? It's something that, no, there's nothing in 17 U.S.C. in the American copyright law that says 5 CPUs and no more. Even if you agree that that's the case, that you've waived those rights, what we see with DRM is that they often and increasingly contain something called renewability. Renewability is one of these euphemisms. The DRM struggle is as much a struggle for language as for anything else. And so we often hear about copyright protection. We often hear about copy protection. I was a systems administrator for a number of years, and I know that the way that you protect your data is by making copies of it. Right? Copy protection is a genuinely Orwellian use of language because you don't protect your music by not making copies of it. In fact, the best way to ensure that your music will always be accessible is to have an off-site backup of it. So this is awfully fraught. So we hear, so even if you waive your rights, oftentimes you run up against renewability, which should be called revocability. And what renewability means is that at regular intervals, or on the basis of some trigger, the device that you're using will phone home or receive an update that tells it what the new permissions and rights are in respect of the works that you want to play on it. So there are some examples of this. If you own a TiVo, these set-top digital television recorders, a little while ago, TiVo pushed out a non-optional firmware upgrade, operating system upgrade to the TiVo that includes a package from a digital rights management vendor called Macrovision. And what this does is allow people to embed in their analog television signals, in the vertical blanking interval of their analog television signals, a tag that says whether or not a show can be recorded at all, and then if it is to be recorded, whether it can be stored for 1 day or 7 days. So when you bought your TiVo, you got a device that lets you record everything that was on television. Sometime later, your TiVo became a device that could record everything on television that hadn't been marked as no record. Again, no nexus with American copyright law. When the Supremes talked about the VCR, they explicitly rejected the idea that we could put tags in video that would allow people to choose whether or not their stuff could be recorded. They said that isn't the way American copyright law should work. This is private law. This is a law that was written as part of a business plan, not law that was written as part of a democratic deliberation. And you, as the user, may have agreed to accept the restrictions that came with your TiVo when you bought it, but you as a user have come up against new restrictions that you never agreed to. And if we want to say that DRM is a contract, we can certainly say that revocability voids any contract that we might have made. And we see that a lot in the field, and it's often the source of really egregious outcomes, like if you have a Comcast PVR with Comcast cable. Last year, just before the DVD of 6 Feet Under came out at the request of HBO, they pushed out a signal to all the Comcast PVRs in America that erased all stored copies of 6 Feet Under, right, so that they could then go out and sell the DVD. Now, again, no, this isn't law. This is just a business model. This is just a boardroom decision. And finally, as I mentioned, digital rights management can't be open source software, because if you're building a technology based on the idea that the user is the attacker, you can't build a technology built on the idea that the user will be able to modify it. So this is all pretty apocalyptic, and a lot of people observe that digital rights management technology will fail because it will drive people to acquire their works outside of the legal system. And I think that's true. You know, the many users of Kazaa and eDonkey and the rest of them are users because they find that if they set out to buy music or movies, they get a movie that is in some sense a lower quality movie, because it's like the movie that you get on eDonkey, but it only plays on a set suite of devices, or it only plays under certain circumstances that have nothing to do with the law. And certainly any iTunes user who's paid 99 cents for a song didn't do that because they wanted the DRM for it. No customer for these technologies woke up wishing for something for a technology that would let them do less with their works. Right? No one woke up this morning saying, I wish there was a way to do less with my music. There's no company that can ship a device in a box that says now with fewer features and hope to sell more of them. Right? So the only way that these things can work is if you can't avail yourself of these self-help measures that allow yourself to get out of the DRM box. And to that end, there are aggressive moves afoot to keep us from getting into these self-help measures. Now, the history of technology is full of instances in which people have found ways to pour the old content wine into the new technology bottle. Right? They transcoded sheet music. They turned phonograms into radio broadcasts. They put radio on the cable and so on. No one had to take a license. They were able to go on doing this because there was no licensable element. And that's certainly the case with free-to-air television, where there's no licensable element of free-to-air television, and so anyone can build a free-to-air television receiver, and provided that it doesn't, you know, emit microwave radiation or interfere with, you know, police radio, you're pretty much good to go. There's a proposal called the broadcast flag that was mooted in Congress and eventually put down and then shifted to the FCC. The FCC, like the Supreme Court, as a group of people who don't have to worry about getting reelected, and so they can break television with impunity. And the proposal was that anyone who builds a digital television receiver should be required by law to only include outputs and recording methods that had been approved by one or more Hollywood studios, right, that had been guaranteed not to unduly disrupt the entertainment industry's business model. The guy who wrote this guy named Andy Sitos from Fox Studios, he described it to me as a well-mannered marketplace, right? Essentially a planned economy for digital technologies. Now, one of the outcomes of saying that only outputs that are approved can sit in these devices is to say that anything that wants to sit downstream of one of those outputs, that is to say if you want to build a DVD recorder that can plug into the outputs, you have to take a license from the people who control the proprietary elements of the output. Right, the patents, the secrets, and so on. And if you're going to get your output approved for use in a digital television context, you're going to have to guarantee that you will never let anyone plug anything into your output that will disrupt the business model. So it's a kind of chain of trust or you know, an extension of the monopoly to this very attenuated end. Now, that said, anything that starts as a scrambled digital signal has to at some point be made into an intelligible analog signal. If I sell you a DVD that just has an encrypted blob on it and don't give you the tools to decrypt it, I've sold you a drinks coaster, right? George, you know, there are lots of things that stand in the way of George Lucas selling DVDs of Star Wars Episode 1, 2, and 3, but it would be an insurmountable hurdle if no one could watch them. You know, arguably it might improve the user experience, but... So this is called the analog hole, the fact that everything is turned into analog and can be therefore redigitized without any of these restrictions. You can just convert free-to-air video back into, you know, when it shows up on the screen, back into an analog signal. You'd think that an organization as media savvy as the Motion Picture Association of America could come up with a better rallying cry than let's plug the a-hole, but this is what they've come up with. And their proposal for plugging the a-hole is to mandate that anyone who wants to implement an analog to digital converter, which being engineers, you know, is the paperclip of engineering, right? Is something that we assign to 17-year-olds as part of their high school assignments. That they're trivial to implement. Anyone who wants to implement a device capable of performing an analog to digital operation will be required by law to build in a signal processing watermark detector from a technology company called Veil. The characteristics of this signal processing technology are secret. You can get a license to decode these, to build a decoder and understand how it works if you pay $10,000 and sign a non-disclosure agreement. The licensing for encoding with this watermark is not, you can't get it under any circumstances. To date, Vail has only had one commercial rollout. That was in a Batman toy. But it's the subject of a bill before Congress now that it would be required by law in all of these. And the idea would be to take the universe of devices now that can get around digital encryption by doing a digital to analog to digital conversion step by eliminating analog to digital converters as well. But that leaves you with another problem, because no matter how good these watermark detectors are, someone out there, probably someone within a few miles of this room, will be smart enough to decrypt it, right? Will be smart enough to get around it, will be smart enough to defeat it. Because again, you put a safe in the bank robber's living room, eventually you're going to find a bank robber who knows how to either acquire or build a blowtorch, right? So you put the safe, so the proposal then is to ensure that when the bank robber breaks the safe door, that he can't distribute the money to everyone. That you'll never be able to go on the internet and decide on day one, am I going to go to Kazaa and get the uncrippled version, or go to iTunes and get the restricted version, because the network itself will restrict your ability to do that. And there are a lot of different proposals for this, but the one that's been off of most people's radar, and the one that I think is the single biggest threat to the way that the network works today, is a proposal at WIPO, at the specialized UN agency that deals with copyright, to impose a new standard for what's called intermediary liability. That's the liability that ISPs face for their users' actions. 1996, when they were writing these treaties, there was a lot of confusion about whether or not ISPs should be held liable for anything. If you walk into a restaurant and you're wearing a T-shirt that has Mickey Mouse giving the finger, the restaurateur is not liable for your trademark infringement. No one asks them to police your T-shirt, right? So ISPs often had made the argument that if we host 10,000 customers' web pages and one of them has something naughty on it, that shouldn't be any different than if we have someone sitting at a table having lunch. But they didn't want to take the chance, because some courts had said yay and some courts had said nay. And there was this horse trading exercise that happened in the treaty negotiation at the UN in 1996, where they said, if you will agree that you should be held liable for your customers' actions for hosted content, we will agree that you can throw away all that liability if you agree to something called a notice and takedown regime, which is when you're put on notice that something is infringing, you take it down. Now, the way that actually ended up shipping was pretty ugly, because the notice that you give to get something taken off a website is, I aver that I represent a rights holder who believes that this infringes his copyrights or her copyrights. You don't have to prove it. You don't even have to say that you know it for a fact. And so as a consequence, if you're a university professor named Usher, you might find that the lectures that are called usher.mp3 on your university's website are the subject of repeated takedown notices from the people who control the copyrights for the band Usher. That happens to a professor named Usher on a regular basis. You might find that if you're criticizing the Church of Scientology on a web page, that the Church of Scientology rings up your ISP and says, I aver that this material infringes my copyright and I demand that you take it down, and it vanishes. If you go to chillingeffects.org, you'll find thousands of these documented, frivolous and non-frivolous, but more often frivolous than not. So this has been punishing but not terrible, because you can always apply to have your material reinstated, and eventually it comes back up again. But this is wholly ineffective against peer-to-peer, because peer-to-peer content isn't hosted by the ISP. If I ring up and say someone at IP address thus and so is running a server process that's making available a copyrighted work, how do you take it down? Right? Do you ring them up and say, okay, so click on the My Shared Files now. Okay, do you see that folder? All right, scroll down a little, find the thing that says usher.mp3 and delete it. And what if they say no? Right? What if they say, I'm not sharing anything. I'm running an open wireless AP that's got 50 people, so all I know is that someone within 300 feet of my house is sharing this file. Right? How do you address this? Well, the proposal is to replace notice and takedown with notice and termination. We go from a regime where content is removed from a website to a regime where a customer's DSL connection or cable modem connection is severed. Now, the thing about DSL and cable modem connections is they're pretty expensive to set up and tear down. Provisioning a circuit can take 1 to 3 years to recoup, depending on the arrangements the ISP has with the telco and depending on what kind of equipment is present when they connect you. Now, if you could be attacked with a denial of service flood of takedown notices or termination notices against your customers, you go out of business. Right? And we see ISPs handling in the thousands of takedown notices from automated processes already. We have no reason to believe termination notices would be any different. So when I asked the MPA's representative at the WIPO hearings that I was at on this, how do you expect this will play out in the real world? He said, well, I think the ISPs will figure out how to contain their liability by doing aggressive filtering of their customers' use of the internet. Deep packet inspection, rate throttling, port blocking, and so on, right? So the idea here is to have a complete circle of restriction, right? You can't build a device unless you get the permission of the person whose content might play on it. You can't build a device that takes something out of those boxes and put it into a new box that's of your own devising, because every ADC will be regulated. And if you figure out how to get around that, you won't be able to put that work on the internet where someone else can get access to it. So no one will be able to make that choice of, am I going to go here or there? We hear often that DRM is a system for keeping honest users honest. It's a speed bump that stops you from getting the work in an infringing way and encourages you to go down the legitimate route. As Ed Felton says, keeping an honest user honest is like keeping a tall user tall. And we've measured the height of that speed bump now, the height of the hurdle that you have to overcome before you get the infringing one. There's a company called Big Champagne that monitors peer-to-peer network use, and in particular times how long it takes between the release of a song in iTunes with no CD release, so it's a DRM-only release, before that is made available on eDonkey and Kazaa, and they've concluded that it's an average 180 seconds. So that's the height of the speed bump. So some concepts that are emerging in digital rights management technology, I touched on them earlier. One is the authorized domain, the idea that you can restrict the use of a work to one household or family's worth of devices, which in effect puts rights holders in charge of how big and what contours your family is allowed to have. If you come from and when you look at the plans for these things, the implementation guidelines, they make explicit accommodation for things like your summer home, because they're being designed by Hollywood executives. What they don't make any explicit or implicit arrangements for is diaspora populations. If you're a Filipino construction worker in Saudi Arabia who's part of a household that's also in Manila, there's no accommodation made for you. There's also no accommodation made for things like if you stick your dad in an old folks home and he joins the ward, is that a household or not? Or if you send your son off to college, or if your daughter goes and lives in a geek house, a group house on off campus, none of those are considered families according to the guidelines set out here, and none of those would be able to have a media area network. And the one that I think was most pernicious and that was always characterized as a corner case, not a fit subject for an engineering discussion when I've raised it, was what if you and your spouse divorce and you have joint custody of a child who goes back and forth from house to house once a week? How do you resolve that? Because, of course, the system will see that as an attacker. You're moving content from one network to another, disassociating and associating, and it'll probably block you. And they say, well, we already, this is a corner case. We can fix it. We've already got solutions to that with like Windows XP activation. If any of you have had the misfortune of activating a copy of Windows XP, you might have found that it says the serial number, while valid, may be dodgy. We don't know. There's something odd going on here. Call this 800 number, explain your circumstances. We can override it if it turns out that what you're doing is right. Well, that sounds like a good idea maybe if you're buying operating systems, but it's a little weird to say to people who want to watch television that they have to call a customer support center and explain the circumstances of their parents' divorce. Right? I think that's far outside of the realm of what we traditionally give to rights holders. So we've killed the broadcast flag in America, but it keeps rearing its ugly head. We went to the Federal Circuit and we said the Federal Communications Commission doesn't have the right to regulate devices after they receive programs. They're about regulating the spectrum use, not about regulating the use, not about regulating the design of devices. And the court said, you're right. If you want to get a regulation like this, Hollywood, you have to find a lawmaker who's willing to introduce it. Now, that had been the original plan all along. Representative Billy Tozan from the now submerged 9th Parish in New Orleans had proposed that he was going to make a law about this, but we went and we interfered with the process through which the broadcast flag was negotiated in an inter-industry negotiation, and we brought in people who objected to it, and when the final report was issued, instead of being 20 pages long, it was 220 pages. The 200 pages were an appendix of people who objected to it, and the lawmaker looked at this and said, I'm not touching this with a 10-foot pole, right? You told me that this would be a little quiet bit of law that no one would ever see. And instead, he punted it to the FCC. They overturned the FCC's regulation. Since then, they've tried to introduce the broadcast flag again and again as riders on balanced budget bills and so on, trying to sneak them in the dead of night. Every time we fired cannon loads of mail into lawmakers' offices, signed by constituents who added their zip codes, and they've turned around and they've embraced this old principle that if you break your constituents' televisions, they won't vote for you anymore, and they've backed off from it. But that doesn't mean it's dead. This won't be dead until we've cut its head off, put garlic in its mouth, sewn the lips shut, and buried it at a crossroads at midnight on a full moon. And we need your help if we're going to keep these mandates from coming to pass. There are things you can do on campus, and there are things that you can do as a citizen. The free culture movement, there's already an active chapter at Harvard. There are also active chapters at many other universities, and these are a network of student organizations that get together to work on these issues, hold symposia and conferences, hold university administration to account over copyright and patent policies that emerge from universities, and so on. You can join Electronic Frontier Foundation, which has a student rate. It's a 501c3 charity. Even if you can't afford the student rate, you can sign up for the mailing list and get alerts about opportunities to write to a lawmaker. And you can go on helping the people around you, because we are the alpha geeks. We are the people who understand that there will never be a time between now and the heat death of the universe when bits are harder to copy than they are at this moment. That this moment in time has the world's most copy-resistant bits in it, and that tomorrow they'll be half as copy-resistant, and the day after they'll be half as copy-resistant, and so on. And any industry that argues that it needs to manufacture laws or technology that give them copy-resistant bits is the walking dead, and preserving them through law and policy is like taking countermeasures to preserve the houses of people who've pitched their tents on the side of an active volcano. It's bad for society, and it's bad for the rest of us, and we all have to bear their costs of their bad decisions. Debbie mentioned I'm a science fiction novelist. My first novel, Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, was the first novel released under what's called a Creative Commons license that allows people to copy it. I did that because I figured that my biggest threat as an author wasn't piracy, it was obscurity, and that if I gave people electronic books, they would buy print books. 650,000 copies have been downloaded from my website. An untold number have been downloaded from other people's websites. The book is in its 6th printing. My second 2 novels have also done very well. My short story collection sold out its print run in 6 weeks. And so it's been, and I think that there are lots of ways to embrace copying that will produce good outcomes for creators, and that copying isn't bad for creators, it's just bad for a certain kind of incumbent, and we shouldn't be rejigging the way that our society works just to preserve some old business model. So thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. So, should we do questions? All right, we've got some time for questions. I'm sorry I went a little longer than I thought I would. I took my watch off before I started. I know some of you have to go to class, but we can have some Q&A now. Go ahead.
So Corey, I've had trouble understanding what's the incentive for all these tech companies to buy into the DRM standards, to buy into the content tool, and sort of bow to all their demands, especially when you start linking up, especially when I want to example CP, they're introducing place shifting, they're introducing a whole other concept of playing through your content, and yet they still have their stream completely encrypted. You don't pay subscription fees, but it's still completely proprietary because there's this danger, this security.
Yeah, so the question...
An engineer can't fix. I can't, be a lawyer.
Right.
That's some trouble.
So the question is, why do tech companies sell out to the entertainment companies? Why do they agree to be arms dealers in this crazy arms race that puts them front and square in it? Where do the Vichy nerds come from? And I think the answer is that for a tech company, DRM is bait that you can put on a hook that will lure entertainment companies' customers into your lockdown, vertically integrated proprietary system. So if you're Steve Jobs, you don't really care if people can listen to music on 5 CPUs or 6. That doesn't have any real impact on your business model. However, if someone buys $100 worth of iTunes, and you can sue anyone who makes a player for iTunes that would be compatible with it, then what you can do is create a $100 switching cost to abandon the iPod and move to a competitor's technology. So the iPods are a really amazing example of this stuff. So every couple of years, they get smaller and cheaper and more feature laden, and they get better by some measure, by some metric. And so they want you to upgrade every couple of years. Now it's tricky to get people to upgrade every couple of years because it kind of means throwing stuff away, and there is still this frisson of guilt that you feel when you throw something away that's shiny and new and futuristic looking. And Apple has completely nailed down the ability to make something that looks like it came from a point 10 minutes in the future, the day it hits the shelves, and 18 months later looks like something that's hanging in a blister pack in sixes at Walgreens. The toilet seat iBook, the iMac, and so on, they make the iPods out of materials that scratch if you look at them cross-eyed. Right? You have to keep them in felt bags, otherwise 18 months later it looks like you put them through a rock tumbler. Right? And so they understand that every 18 months you're going to buy a new iPod. The problem with buying a new iPod every 18 months is if you can unlock the iPod or unlock your iTunes music and move to someone else's device, then every 18 months there's a juncture at which Apple has to resell you, not just on the idea of getting a more capable device, but of getting their more capable device. Now, if they can bait the hook with $100 worth of music that you have to throw away when you switch players, then it increases it allows them to have the best of both worlds. They can sell you an upgrade every 18 months and be sure that you won't buy someone else's, you won't cross-grade every 18 months. And that's really good news for them. And what it does for the entertainment industry, and the entertainment industry is starting to wise up to this, is it turns the entertainment industry into a commodity back-end supplier for a tech company's proprietary system. So like Macrovision is mandated in all VCRs, and as a consequence, if you want to implement, if you want to keep your DVD from being copied through a trivial analog connection to a VCR, you have to license Macrovision. So since it was mandated in the law in 1998, Macrovision has doubled and doubled and doubled the licensing fees for Macrovision. It's got the studios over a barrel. They can't switch to a competitor's product. Edgar Bronfman Jr. from Universal went to Apple and said, I want to change the deal that we license iTunes under. And Steve Jobs laughed him out of the boardroom. He said, well, what are you going to do, license to Rhapsody and withdraw our licenses? Good luck getting people to throw away their iPods and buy Rhapsody devices to play their music on, because anyone who puts a Rhapsody player on an iPod, we're going to sue into a smoking hole. So now what they're doing is they're encouraging the creation of consortia that are made out of fragile companies that are incapable of presenting a united bargaining front. So DVD Blu-ray and DVD HD is the most prominent example of this, where you have two consortia locked in a death battle to see who can produce the worst product. Because the company that makes the worst product gets the best content licenses, right? And because they're competing with one another, the studios can trade them one off against the other. DVD Blu-ray just put region coding back in, right? When the HD standards started, when the two standards efforts started, they both of them issued kind of press releases saying, we're going to fix all the mistakes we made. Number one mistake, region coding. Everyone hates it. Honest people don't like it. We're execs, we travel around the world a lot. We buy DVDs in airports and we put them in our computers, and our computer says, sorry, I'm from a different region, and spits it back out again. Everyone hates it. It's back in. It's back in because when you're in a race to the bottom, no mud is too filthy to spread around on your product when it comes time to showing the studios that you will give them anything they want. Bob Frankston, co-inventor of the spreadsheet.
Corey was mine. It's actually much worse. But I wanted to tell you something you can do. You're in Barney Frank's district. Barney has a lot of good things about Barney, but one thing he wants to do is make sure the artists get paid. He's not a technologist. So each of you individually should write to him, and have a friend write to him, saying that, well, you don't have to argue too much. Artists don't really get paid, but I couldn't convince him of that. But say you're very concerned about the damage you're doing in the future in a world that's all about keeping Hollywood executives paid and not allowing new technology.
Thanks, Bob. Other questions?
The orange shirt underneath. How come artists are buying into it? I mean, why is Metallica entrenched and DJ Danger Mouse so controversial? How come artists are buying into all this?
It's another good question, and really I like the way that you guys are dissecting this, because the thing to understand is that everyone has a different reason for wanting DRM. I think there are a number of things that drive artists to do this. One is that they have been sold a bill of goods. In his books, The Anarchist in the Library, Siva Vaidyanathan documents the fact that basically in the 90s and the early 2000s, science fiction writers in the guise of technologists told all these funny stories about how you'd be able to charge people for stuff that they were never able to charge for again, and do micropayments and all this stuff that really hasn't ever emerged, and when it has emerged, it's been so gross that no one wanted to use it. And so there are a lot of people who believe that. The other thing is that artists have been very rightly schooled that to the extent that they yield their copyrights up to their publishers, that they get a really raw deal, because copyrights are one of the only things that can balance out the arrangements between the negotiating positions of authors and publishers. There's generally speaking, a buyer's market for art, because there's a lot more people who want to make art than there are people who want to buy it, right? I heard a poet, a famous British poet, give a speech the other day about how poets need more copyright to preserve their revenue. And we sat down afterwards and I said, do you honestly believe that you could get more copyright and get more money for poetry? Surely the problem with poetry is that there's more of it than anyone wants to buy, right? And so to the extent that a studio can almost always find a substitute, or a publisher can almost always find a substitute who's willing to sell themselves out for worse terms than you, copyright gives you some negotiating power. Now the thing is that a tool that's excellent for getting leverage on a large industrial multinational that's engaged in publishing your work is not an appropriate tool for getting leverage on your audience. And what you end up doing when you put DRM on your works, and artists are starting to wake up to this, is you alienate your audience. Like, look at the Sony Rootkit technologies. These were technologies that restricted the way that you could use a Sony CD. They spied on you. They made your computer vulnerable to attacks and so on. And every artist who had this applied to it, when tracked down by the press, howled, because of course you want to be remembered as the guy who wrote the song that your fan lost his virginity to, not the guy who wrote the song that your fan lost his computer to. And so artists got really upset, and people I know inside Sony BMG tell me that actually the label heads at Sony BMG have hated this for a long time. It was corporate at Sony BMG that insisted on putting this on, and that this has actually evinced a shift in the balance of power in the boardrooms at Sony, where because it was such a debacle, because it was so expensive, and the expenses haven't even settled out yet on this. I mean, the federal government hasn't taken a computer fraud and abuse crack at them for infecting tens of thousands of military networks yet, and when that shoe drops, it's going to be bad news for Sony. I think that now those people are starting to get a hearing.
I was wondering, you said that when you're making a device, you just need permission from one studio. Is it possible for all the people who are creating their own media now to make their own studio?
No, it was one MPA member company. So the question was, could you get around the broadcast flag by finding a studio that, by forming a studio that was friendly to your interests, and then having that studio rubber stamp all of your applications? But no.
So then what other ways can device makers use to get around this?
What other ways can device makers use to get around this? The analog hole, right? There are an increasing number of devices like the Neuros Recorder 2, the Slingbox, and so on, that plug into the analog outputs of a device, because you don't need to take a license. And then they redigitize the contents. They plug into the analog outputs of a DVD or cable box, redigitize the contents, and then do interesting and useful things with it. They turn it into a movie you can watch at a distance. They turn it into something you can library. To see the economic costs of not being able to do that with a raw format, take a look at the difference between DVDs and CDs. If you went into Tower Records 10 years ago and bought $1,000 worth of CDs, which don't require any licenses to make a new device for, to make a new player for, 10 years later, the CD has paid out gigantic dividends. You can take that CD and turn the music on it into ringtones, karaoke, MP3, MP3 CD. It spurred it created the iPod, it created the Neuros recorders, it created all the other devices and so on. That's a dividend that's paid on your investment in the format. If you bought $1,000 worth of DVDs 10 years ago, all you can do with them today is watch them. Right? That dividend was never paid. And so a lot of people are saying, well, how can we realize those dividends on digitally encrypted media? It's by extracting it from the analog source. The trick, I think, and if any of you are looking for interesting projects to work on, content hashing and metadata matching, because one of the problems when you take digital media out and convert it to an analog form is that you lose the metadata. You lose its file name, you lose any of the other data associated with it. But content hash matching, where you make a hash like an MD5 hash or a series of MD5 hashes out of the content, and then try to match that against a metadata database like the MetaBrains one, the MusicBrainz database of music tracks and so on, allows you to reassociate metadata, so you can pull it out and put it back in again. There's a device that a couple of guys in London have made called the Promise TV that grabs 7 days worth of the free-to-air multiplex and stores it to a hard drive. So it grabs everything. And you can then you can view it through different ways. You can say, like, is there anything that my friends have watched this week stored on my recorder? right? Because you've all got the same 7 days worth of multiplex, you can do that. They can do it because the electronic program guide is free to air there. There's a digital electronic program guide that you can slurp down and then use to cut up the video and associate metadata with it. Where there is no such EPG, you need to be able to roll your own EPG. You and then Bob again, and then you.
So one issue I think we've lost, we think all about the music, thinking of our iPod, thinking of our CD players. Cell phones is a lot future market.
Mhm.
And sadly with cell phones, you can't go around and sell direct to the user because literally only our 4 customers with cell phones, Sprint, Verizon, T-Mobile, and Cingular. They buy directly from device makers.
Yeah.
So is DRM cell phones a lost cause? I mean, Verizon restricts my ability to send files over Bluetooth to my devices. I can't ever get my ringtones, around anything. Is there
Yeah.
any chance?
So the thing about mobile companies is they've bought into this myth that content is king. If content were king, then telecoms wouldn't be the $6 trillion industry it is, and Hollywood wouldn't be the $60 billion industry it is. They'd be reversed. If content was king, and I sent you to a desert island and gave you the option of taking either your records or your friends, and you chose your records, we wouldn't call you a sociopath, right? But conversation is king. And the phone companies have had a failure of imagination when it comes to figuring out how to add value to their devices by putting content on it. If you stuck one of these Promise TV boxes on top of your TV and then had it record the entire free-to-air multiplex, sync components of it to your devices when you were within physical range of it, and then when you were on the road, sync it over GPRS or EVDO or whatever, you'd have a business model that was ready for the carriers and the handset vendors without having to take a license from the studios. You could pour the old wine into your new bottle. And I think a lot of them have started to look at this. I'm really hoping Sun will start to come around here, because Sun instead has been using the fact that mobile handsets are essentially a trusted computing platform that look for signed code before they'll execute, that to really break whatever fragile kind of unity the tech industry had by shipping what they've called an open source DRM, which is a DRM where the source is available for inspection, but if you change one line of it and recompile it, it won't execute anymore because it won't match the signature. So it's open source, you can't modify. And they claim that this solves the DRM problem, right? I hope instead that they'll say, well, we can go out and sell people on the idea of buying a Sun server for their homes instead of a Windows server for their homes, because after all, what does Windows know about servers? Everyone knows Sun makes the best servers in the world. We'll put Sun servers in your living room, get a Java footprint in your house, right? Because they've been trying to do this since Java first emerged from Sun, and we'll deliver a business model that the carriers can love, that the mobile companies can love, and that the studios will have to come around for instead of the other way around. Just like when the VCR was everywhere, the studios had to start licensing for VCRs, Bob?
Okay, so I don't have to repeat anything. On my website, I've been writing about telecom. The short answer is there's no such thing as a telecom industry. It's an artifact of regulation, and the problems are far deeper than just they're destroying the handsets. So I won't go to that. I do want to mention, there was an experience with DRM in your LCD screen. If you've got a Comcast box, the HD box with DVI outputs, plug that into your DVI monitor. You'll get a message saying, sorry, you're not allowed to do that. You have to use the analog connectors. And when you use the analog connectors, some stations you get HD, like on an 802, which is WGBH, but others you can get a low-res version of the movie, because they're already saying that you're only allowed to use expensive, broken, limited capability LCDs. If you buy a high-quality 1920 by 1200 resolution, you can't use it.
Thanks. There was another question there, yeah?
So to complete the equation, I guess, what is the incentive for the politicians that do support DRM to support it? And if the answer is campaign finance contributions, I'm going to be disappointed.
Well, campaign finance contributions are a part of it, but I think if you want to really look at it, you really should look to game theory. It is the case that people who play games together get better at emerging outcomes that are good for all of them, and people who don't play games together tend to be easier to divide and rule. And so the entertainment industry has been playing Congress since 1908 and the phonograms. And as a consequence, they will present a united front and all say the same message when it comes time to making a law. When the tech companies turn up, they've all got their own competitive interests at heart. Microsoft doesn't want technology mandates unless it benefits Microsoft. Sun doesn't want technology mandates unless it benefits Sun. You know, Google is pretty good about swinging its weight around until it wants to find a way to compete with Yahoo. And so it starts to put Google DRM on their video. And so as a consequence, I think it's, you know, the tech industry is just failing to swing its weight. It's punching well below its weight. And I think there are two other factors that impact that. One is that the tech industry was incubated through the military. And if you're incubated through the military, the way that you achieve special power or privilege through the state is by pleasing generals, right? And so tech industry has got a pretty refined mechanism for pleasing generals. You know, the stories of tech shows with hospitality rooms are kind of legendary. Whereas if you need to lobby Congress, it's much harder. Now, the fact that generals were always available to the tech industry for years to give them all the help they needed led a lot of tech industry people to believe that superior technology could make inferior laws irrelevant, right? I call it nerd determinism. Right? You know, you can pass all the dumb laws you want. The broadcast flag won't stop me from watching my video the way I can find a region-free DVD player. Dum-ty-dum-ty-dum, right? And I think that's been really dangerous. And the corollary of that attitude is nerd fatalism, right? Anyone who engages in politics ends up smelling like the people who live in D.C., right? If you go and wallow in the muck, it'll stick to you. And so they've been unwilling to kind of lower themselves to the level of a political debate. You know, it's the force of pure reason that's going to overcome this, not venal lobbying and glad handing. And so, you know, luckily those attitudes are starting to change, slowly but surely. Verizon and Sprint both turned up at the last Access to Knowledge Treaty meeting, where we're drafting a treaty to safeguard the rights of educators, archivists, and people who provide access to disabled people at WIPO in Geneva, and they're sending representatives out to this. So we've got Médecins Sans Frontières talking about access to medicine, and we've got Sprint and Verizon talking about intermediary liability, you know, and all of them coming to realize that there's a common cause and presenting a united front, and I think that's very good news.
Where do you think this fight can be won? Will it be consumers that say no? Will it be legislators, do you think? Or will it be a device maker that says, you know, I'm not going to do that and people buy that?
I think it's all three. I think that what you get is what we need is a politicization of this consumer revolt that is represented by the peer-to-peer file sharing community. And they're more than half of the internet users in the world are file sharers. When they shut down Napster, there were 52 million American Napster users. That's 2 million more than voted for Bush in that presidential election. You could elect a president if you could get all those people pointed in the same direction. But when they turned off Napster, people ran ran like roaches after you turned on the light in the kitchen. And it was because there was no political consciousness that working in a world where 80% of the music wasn't available for sale at any price, where you had managed to put all of that music back on the internet in 18 scant months without any centralized cost being borne, where you'd essentially built the largest library of human creativity ever made, and having witnessed the spectacle of it burning to the ground, that was something that you should get behind, that pitchforks it's time to get the pitchforks and torches and defend it. Instead, people felt like, well, I was doing something kind of shameful and I got caught, and you know, maybe I'll find some other way to do something shameful. You know, all the Kazas and so on popped up, but I'm not gonna go out and say I'm a proud file sharer. But file share pride is starting to emerge. People are starting to say, the thing that's broken here isn't file sharing, it's that we haven't figured out how to compensate artists for file sharing. Let's do that. EFF, if you go to EFF.org/share, there's a proposal that is built on something that a lot of academics and economists have talked about, which is blanket licensing for the internet, where people who want to share music take a license the same way people who want to run a radio station do, and in exchange they get the unlimited right to share the music. Terry Fisher at Harvard has done some very good work on this, as have others. I think that for so long as there are consumers who are, you know, users, I don't like the word consumer because it makes me think of something very passive, and I think, you know, the internet, we're very active users of the internet. You know, we're producers as much as consumers, but I think that end users, that the public, for so long as they evince the willingness to choose technologies on the basis of the liberty it affords them, we hold out the possibility that a company will deliver a technology that delivers more freedoms, not because they're like patchouli-scented info hippies, but because they think they can make more money by selling you a device like the Neuros. You know, I think the Neuros Recorder 2 is a brilliant device. It takes everything that comes over your television and puts it onto your PSP without you having to pay any money. Just about one more question? Okay. Anyone want to ask a last question? You, sir.
You've been talking about how you've met with RIA and MPA members and discussed views, and you say they would express the views and you'd respond back to them. How did they react to, for instance, discussion of what essentially their technology is doing to users' rights and essentially reverting back to a dark age period?
Well, first of all, they say that they disagree. And then they say stuff like Larry Kenswell from Universal once shouted from a stage at the Royal Society for the Arts in London, fair use is the last defense of the scoundrel. Microsoft employee named Amir, I've forgotten his surname, at a conference that I spoke at a couple of weeks ago in London, said that the reason that Microsoft DRM licensing terms exist isn't to recoup their costs. It's in fact very cheap. The only reason they put it there is to keep hobbyists out because they couldn't possibly oversee a licensing program where every hobbyist was allowed to participate as well. A guy named Tom Rivers from the Association for Commercial Television in Europe said that if they didn't have, if he wasn't able to control the copyrights in factual programming, which usually isn't the subject of copyrights, like the broadcast of the ceremony at Dieppe, which was the World War I memorial ceremony, that no one would arrange for future productions of these things. The studios, the NBC people said they would withdraw their content from television if there wasn't a broadcast flag, and they never made good on that threat, and so on. Jack Valenti is kind of a master of this. He's really good at pretending not to understand questions. So Henry Jenkins from MIT talked to him about the way that his work is curtailed by digital rights management and by draconian copyright, and he literally said, "I don't understand what you're talking about. Next question, please." They've got some standard talking points. They say things like, "Why should you be allowed to back up your DVDs? You can't back up a set of crystal dinnerware." Right? So as though that's a feature and not a bug. Anyway, I think on that note, thanks.
I think I'd just like to thank Corey on behalf of all of us for speaking here today.